Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance across the front line. The Russians advanced north of the Vorishna along the Oskil river line, to the south of Makiyivka along the Serpis river line, in the eastern bank of Serpis river line near Yampolivka, both within the town from the northern direction and from the eastern direction along the forest patches. The Russians had managed to take control of the remaining parts of Bilohorivka, getting full control over the village. The Russians also managed to push west of Andriivka within the town and along the fortified positions to the north, gaining control over further positions. And to the west of Velika Novosilka, the Russians made several advances alongside the main road and towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. The Russians restarted offensive operations in the south near Velika Novosilka following a break following the capture of the town, and the Russians are nearing full control over Andriivka to the northwest of Kurahove, which will allow the Russians to close the pocket west of the town. The Russians also managed to restart operations near Yampolivka as their fighting is continuing alongside the first patches, which are very difficult to push through. The Russians are also continuing offensive operations along the Oskil river line to expand their bridgehead across and to allow for more crossings towards the western bank of the river line and to advance towards the border area between Russia and Ukraine. Starting out in the south near Velika Novosilka, the Russians managed to advance across the main road towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians as they're fighting two fortified positions of the Ukrainians ahead of the main defensive lines towards Borilatske and Previlne. The Russians also advanced alongside the road in the western direction towards Novosilka and along the fortified positions south of the road towards the Zaporizhzhia border area. The Russians are here continuing offensive operations following the capture of Velika Novosilka and Vremivka, with the capture of the forest lines to the northwest of Vremivka, and now fighting alongside the western parts as well. The Russians seem to have, with their frontline alliance near Novi Komar to the fortified positions, planning on attacking the fortified positions from the flank, but at the same time they're expanding their attack from the southern flank, where the objective is to attack the fortified positions head on through an uphill battle, which is a very difficult fight to take. But this will also allow the Russians to have more success on the eastern flank, as the Ukrainians would have to spread out their forces more. And at the same time, with this pressure along the southern flank, the Russians are able to attack in the western flank to gain some sort of success there as well, alongside the fortified positions of the Ukrainians, as they'll be unable to send reinforcements to that area as long as they have to defend against Russian forces attacking from the eastern and southern directions. This will allow the Russians to advance on the western flank to put the Ukrainians in a pincer maneuver as they're being stormed head-on by the Russian forces from the south. Therefore, we're seeing some movement here near Velika Novosilka as the Russian offensive operations restarted following the capture of the town. In the direction of Kurahove, following the capture of Dashne, the Russians are fully focusing on the fight near Andriivka, and within the town, the Russians have gained control over further fortified positions on the northern flank of Andriivka, pushing the Ukrainians out to the remaining fortified positions in the northwestern outskirts of the town. At the same time, the Russians managed to reach the western outskirts of Andriivka, as fighting is taking place there as well, as the Russians are looking to squeeze out the Ukrainians towards the fortified positions to the north and northwest of the town. The objective of the Russians here, with their movement going in the western direction along the main highway, is to prevent the Ukrainians from making use of the basements and holding up within the town to delay the Russian capture of it. Instead, what they're doing is that they're focusing along the residential area to clear the buildings and push the Ukrainians back out towards the fortified positions. This allowed the Russians to fight the Ukrainians out in the open near the fortified positions and push them out towards the forest lines, whereas if they were squeezed out to the western parts of the town and forced to retreat from there, there's no forest lines, there's nothing but open fields and a highway towards Oleksivka. This would mean that the Ukrainians would make a last stand at the edge of the town, similar to what they did at Dashne, as they would have nowhere else to withdraw to. And based on that, we see that the Russians have changed their tactics from that to squeeze the Ukrainians out of the town itself and then into the fortified positions, where they'll then push the Ukrainians out of these fortified positions along the forest lines, where they can escape through the cover of the forest areas, where the Russians will be constantly bombarding them with the use of FPV drones and artillery. In general, through the first 2 weeks of February, the Russian advances across the entire section of the front line have been fairly slow, and the Ukrainians have been able to launch some counterattacks. This is due to the Russians rotating their forces and having a break following the capture of several towns and settlements across the southern section of the front line. This allowed the Ukrainians to strike while the Russians were rotating, allowing them to dislodge some of the Russian positions from the fortified areas. But the Russians have been holding on with the forces they left behind during this rotation, and as the rotation finishes, the Russians will be launching new offensive operations across the Pokrovsk section of the front line. It seems that this rotation will be the final one ahead of the siege of Pokrovsk, as the Russians are now at the gates of the city, both from the southern and western directions, and while in the eastern direction they are controlling the intersection, and this has marked the beginning of the siege through the cutting of the road in the eastern direction and southwestern direction, leaving only two roads in and out of Pokrovsk, the northern one through the Donetsk region itself, and the northwestern one towards the city of Dnipro in the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians in the west of Bilohorivka managed to gain control of the remaining parts of the town, which is completely destroyed. There's a small area in between the waste heap and the town itself, which remains in a gray zone where the Ukrainians may be operating within, which means that the Russians would not have full control over the town in its entirety. But we do also see that the area all the way from Bilohorivka to Serebryanki is completely destroyed, and there's a little presence of Ukrainian forces in those areas. Instead, the majority of the forces are fighting by the fortified positions, where the operations would be to hold out these positions in the fortified areas until the Russians launch an offensive operation, to which the Ukrainians will be launching FPV strikes and artillery strikes on the Russian forces to then damage them as much as possible for Ukrainian counterattack to strike the Russian forces and push them back towards Bilohorivka and to the rear, where there are fortified positions all around Bilohorivka. The Siversk section of the front line is the one that is the most reminiscent of the First World War. This section of the front line, as well as the Zaporizhia section, where it is trenches in front of trenches and complete destruction, leaving a no man's land between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, and that is what makes it so difficult for either side to make any advances in this section of the front line, and leaves this section of the front line completely stale for both sides, unless a large assault happens or the Ukrainian forces are forced to withdraw due to an encirclement of their forces. Then this front line will not be moving anytime soon. Instead, what we're seeing in the northern flank near Terny is that the Russians have managed to push through towards the southern outskirts of Yampolivka, where the Ukrainians are pushed back to the crossing between that and Myrne, as well as to the road down towards Zareshne and Torske to the south. At the same time, the Russians restart offensive operations along the forest patches and forest lines to the east of Yampolivka to connect the eastern section of the front line with the northern section of the front line and to gain full control over Yampolivka. This will allow the Russians to then push towards Myrne in the western bank of the Siversk River line and gain full control over the Siversk River line from the northern flank, all the way from the fortified positions north of Kolidyasi and down towards the outskirts of Torske, and this allowed the Russians to attack the town itself from the northern and eastern directions, and this could completely switch the power balance around in the Torske direction, as the Ukrainians would have lost a lot of their positions, both the towns of Terny, Novosadove, Avdiivka, Bilohorivka, Myrne, and then was the pressure on Yampolivka and the towns of Zareshne and Torske. The Russian pressure here along the Siversk River line will likely increase as Russians continue offensive operations along the western bank of the Siversk River line and alongside the river line itself west of Kreminna. We'll likely see continuous Russian offensive operations over the next few weeks and months in the Liman-Kreminna section of the front line. We also see the Russians continued offensive operations west of Makiivka along the Siversk River line, gain control over some of the fortified positions and forest patches in the area, as the Russians look to gain control over the fortified areas here southwest of Makiivka, to expand their zone of control west of the river line and to connect with their forces near Avdiivka, creating a large and wide bridgehead across the river line for further offensive operations launched both in the direction of Borova but also in the direction of Liman to the north and to the south. The Russians north of the Vrishna expanded their zone of control, capturing some of these forest lines and expanding their zone of control along the Oskil River line itself. The Russians now control a very wide area of the western bank of the Oskil River line, which began with some crossings towards the Vrishna, gaining control over the Vrishna and now the surrounding areas, which is allowing the Russians to expand their forces in the area west of the Oskil River line and their operations, thereby attacking in 3 separate directions: north towards the border area, northwest towards the highway along in the direction of Vovtyansk, and in the southern direction towards Kupiansk. With these 3 operations, all 3 are aimed at expanding the Russian capabilities to launch offensive operations in the western bank of the Oskil River line in the Kharkiv region. This will allow the Russians to launch offensive operations in the future towards Izium in the south and along the entirety of the Oskil River line to gain control of this area east of Kharkiv and to threaten the Ukrainian positions within the Donetsk region by cutting off the supplies connected from Kharkiv towards the Donetsk region. In conclusion, we see that the Russian forces are expanding their offensive operations in the eastern section of the front line following a short break, which allowed the Ukrainians to take advantage of that and launch some counterattacks. The Russians will likely speed up their gains starting again in the next coming days, allowing them to gain control of the area to the south of Pokrovsk along the border area with the Dnipropetrovsk region. And according to Russian sources of soldiers on the ground, they have not yet received orders to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region, so instead we'll see them stopping by the border area until further orders are received, and therefore we'll see offensive operations being focused around the southern flank in the Pokrovsk direction to be focused around taking control of the area up to the border area and not moving into the Dnipropetrovsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.